The Man Who Lived Twice, the extraordinary true story of Phineas Gage. In the summer of 1848, a young man was working on a railroad in Vermont. He was 25 years old. He was considered by everyone who knew him and worked alongside him to be one of the most capable and reliable men on the crew. His supervisors trusted him completely. His colleagues liked him. He was described in the accounts of people who knew him as efficient, responsible, and possessed of a steady and practical intelligence that made him exceptionally good at his job. His name was Phineas Gage. And what happened to him on the afternoon of the 13th of September, 1848, would change the way human beings understood the brain forever. The crew Phineas worked with was laying track for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad through the rocky terrain of Cavendish, Vermont. This was difficult and dangerous work. The rock had to be cleared to make way for the track bed, and the primary method for doing this was blasting. Holes were drilled into the rock by hand. Those holes were filled with explosive powder. A fuse was inserted. Sand was packed on top of the powder to direct the force of the blast downward into the rock, rather than upward into the air. The tool used to pack the sand was called a tamping iron. It was essentially a long metal rod, pointed at one end for drilling and flat at the other for tamping. The one belonging to Phineas was custom made to his specifications. It was 3 feet 7 inches long. It was 1.25 inches in diameter at its widest point. It weighed 13.5 pounds. Phineas knew this tool better than almost anything else in his life. He had used it every working day for years. The actions involved in using it were as automatic to him as breathing. On the afternoon of September 13th, the crew was working on a section of particularly stubborn rock. A hole had been drilled, the powder had been placed. Phineas was preparing to pack the sand on top, but something went wrong. The exact sequence of events was debated afterward, but the outcome was not. The powder ignited before the sand had been packed. The tamping iron became a projectile. It entered Phineas Gage's skull just below his left cheekbone. It passed through his head. It exited through the top of his skull. It continued upward through the air and landed approximately 25 feet away from where he was standing, covered in blood and brain matter. The men around him watched this happen. They stood in a moment of complete and total stillness. Then Phineas Gage sat up. He was conscious. He was talking. He was describing what had just happened to him. The men who were present would describe this moment for the rest of their lives, and none of them ever found adequate language for what it felt like to watch a man speak coherently seconds after a 13-pound metal rod had passed completely through his head. They put him in an ox cart. They drove him 3/4 of a mile to the hotel in Cavendish where he was staying. Phineas sat upright in the cart the entire way. When they arrived at the hotel, he climbed down from the cart himself. He sat in a chair on the porch and waited for the doctor. The local physician was a man named John Martin Harlow. He arrived to find Phineas sitting in the chair, alert, oriented, and apparently aware of what had happened to him. The wound at the top of his skull was extraordinary. Harlow could see brain tissue. The skull had been fractured outward by the force of the rod's exit. The damage was severe and visible, and by any reasonable medical understanding of the time should have been immediately fatal. Phineas asked when he could go back to work. Harlow treated the wound as best he could with the tools available to a rural Vermont physician in 1848. He cleaned it. He removed fragments of bone. He dressed it. Then he waited for Phineas to die. Because in 1848, surviving what Phineas Gage had survived was not something that happened. Nobody survived having a 13-pound iron rod pass through their skull and out the top of their head. Nobody, but Phineas did not die. He developed a serious infection over the following weeks that brought him genuinely close to death. He lost consciousness. He was delirious. For a period of time, Dr. Harlow himself believed the end was imminent and prepared accordingly. But Phineas came back from that too. By January of 1849, less than 4 months after the accident, Phineas Gage was sufficiently recovered to leave Cavendish and return to his family in New Hampshire. He had survived, and this was extraordinary. But it was not the most extraordinary thing about the story of Phineas Gage. The most extraordinary thing was what had happened to him on the inside. The people who had known Phineas before the accident were consistent in their description of him: reliable, steady, responsible. A man whose word meant something and whose judgment could be trusted. A man who planned ahead and followed through and treated the people around him with basic and uncomplicated decency. After the accident, they described a different person. Not in his intelligence. His memory appeared intact. His ability to speak and reason and move through the world remained largely unaffected. But his personality had changed so profoundly that the people who had known him struggled to reconcile the man in front of them with the man they remembered. He became fitful and irreverent. He made plans he did not follow through on. He could not keep a job. He argued with people who tried to manage him. He made decisions with no apparent consideration of their consequences. Dr. Harlow summarized it in the phrase that would follow Phineas Gage through history. He said that Phineas was no longer Phineas. In 1848, nobody could explain this. The brain was understood in only the most basic terms. The idea that specific regions of the brain controlled specific aspects of personality and behavior was not yet established medical science. The dominant understanding of the time was that the brain functioned as a whole rather than as a collection of specialized regions. Phineas Gage had survived in a way that contradicted everything medicine understood about survival, and he had changed in a way that contradicted everything medicine understood about the brain. He had become, without intending to, the most important neurological case in human history. He spent the years after his accident moving from place to place and job to job with the restless inconsistency that had replaced his former steadiness. He worked for a while at Barnum's American Museum in New York, where he was exhibited as a curiosity alongside the tamping iron that had passed through his head. He carried the iron with him everywhere in the years after the accident. It appeared in every photograph taken of him, and he held it in the same way a person holds something that has become inseparable from their identity. He worked as a stagecoach driver in Chile for several years. This job required significant skill and reliability, and the fact that he held it for an extended period has led some researchers to suggest that his impairments were less severe in the long term than the early accounts suggested. He returned to the United States in 1859. His health was deteriorating by this point. He had begun experiencing seizures. They increased in frequency and severity throughout the early months of 1860. On the 18th of May, 1860, Phineas Gage died during a seizure at his mother's home in San Francisco. He was 36 years old. He had lived for nearly 12 years after the tamping iron had passed through his skull. 12 years that medicine had no framework to account for and no language to adequately describe. He was buried in the Lone Mountain Cemetery in San Francisco, and there the story might have ended. But the story of Phineas Gage did not end with his death. It was in many ways only beginning. Dr. Harlow had maintained contact with the Gage family in the years since the accident. When he learned of Phineas's death in 1860, he wrote to the family with a request. He asked if the family would allow him to exhume the body and examine the skull. This was not an unusual request for the period. Medical science in the 19th century relied heavily on post-mortem examination, and the case of Phineas Gage was of sufficient medical significance that Harlow felt the examination of his skull could contribute meaningfully to the understanding of brain function. The family agreed. The skull was exhumed and sent to Harlow along with the tamping iron that had been buried with Phineas at the family's request. Harlow examined both carefully. He published his findings in 1868, 20 years after the accident. His paper described in detail the path of the tamping iron through the skull and attempted to map the regions of the brain that had been damaged based on the entry and exit wounds. He concluded that the damage had been primarily to the frontal regions of the brain, and he argued that this damage was directly responsible for the personality changes that had transformed Phineas Gage from the reliable and steady man his colleagues remembered into the fitful and inconsistent person he became after the accident. This conclusion was not immediately accepted. The idea that the frontal lobes of the brain were specifically responsible for personality, for the regulation of behavior and decision-making and social judgment, was deeply controversial in 1868. But Harlow was right. The frontal lobes are now understood to be precisely what he said they were. The region of the brain responsible for planning, for impulse control, for the regulation of social behavior, for the ability to weigh consequences and make decisions that align with long-term goals rather than short-term impulses. Phineas Gage had lost a significant portion of his frontal lobe function on the 13th of September 1848, and in losing it, he had demonstrated to medicine, at the cost of everything that had made him who he was, that personality was not something separate from the physical brain. That who a person was, their character, their reliability, their social judgment, the quality of their relationships and their decisions, and their ability to move through the world as the person others knew them to be, all of this lived in specific physical tissue. Tissue that could be damaged, tissue that could be destroyed, and when it was, the person inside could change so completely that the people who loved them struggled to find anything familiar in the face looking back at them. The skull of Phineas Gage and the tamping iron that passed through it are both held today at the Warren Anatomical Museum at Harvard Medical School. They have been there since Harlow donated them in 1867. For over 150 years, researchers and students and curious visitors have stood in front of that skull and that iron rod and tried to imagine the moment on the 13th of September 1848 when one became connected to the other. In 1994, a team of researchers used the skull measurements and modern neuroimaging technology to reconstruct the most likely path of the tamping iron through the brain. Their findings confirmed what Harlow had argued. The damage was primarily to the left frontal lobe. In 2012, another team used an even more sophisticated reconstruction to refine the picture further. They found that the tamping iron had likely damaged not only the frontal lobe, but also a network of connections between the frontal lobe and deeper brain structures involved in emotional regulation and decision-making. This network is now understood to be central to the way the brain integrates emotion and reason in the process of making decisions. Phineas Gage had lost the ability to integrate his emotions and his reason. He could still think, he could still feel, but the mechanism that connected those two things and allowed them to work together in the production of sound judgment had been severed, and this had made him, in the most fundamental sense, a different person. The case of Phineas Gage sits at the foundation of modern neuroscience in the specific way that a small number of individual cases sit at the foundation of entire fields of knowledge. He did not choose to contribute to science. He did not choose any of what happened to him on that September afternoon. He chose to go to work on a railroad in Vermont, and something went wrong, and a 13-pound iron rod passed through his head, and he sat up and asked when he could go back to work. And everything that followed from that moment, the survival that should not have been possible, the transformation that should not have been explicable, the 12 years of a changed life, the examination of his skull in the decades after his death, the reconstructions and the papers, and the century and a half of researchers standing in front of his remains, trying to understand what he could tell them about what it meant to be a person. All of it happened because of one afternoon, one moment, one accident on a September afternoon in a field in Vermont. That changed the way human beings understood themselves forever. Phineas Gage died at 36 in his mother's house. His name was largely forgotten for most of the century that followed, but the questions his survival raised did not go away. They accumulated, they deepened, they became the questions that neuroscience is still trying to answer today. Questions about where the self lives, about whether who we are is fixed or fragile, about what it would mean to lose the thing that makes us recognizable to the people who love us, about the distance between the brain and the person, and whether that distance is as large as we need it to be. Phineas Gage spent 12 years living with a version of himself that he had not chosen and could not fully understand. Nobody who knew him before ever fully found him again in the person he became. But he was still there, still moving through the world, still carrying the iron rod that had changed everything, still asking in his own way the question that all of us ask eventually, the question of how much of who we are is really ours to keep, and how much of it was always more fragile than we knew.